The video is a little bit longer tonight, so I'm going to go really quick. But let me just tell you what's there. We're about to, it's really deep. It's about to dive deep, okay? Basically, he's going to spend the whole video tonight on a half a verse, So, and you'll see why. The text, we're starting the text tonight, and the text is Genesis 2 through 5, and he's calling it in the video the Eden story. The Eden narrative, okay? And that's what it is. By the end of the narrative, by the end of chapter 4 and 5, they're out of Eden. At the beginning of chapter 2, they're just getting into Eden. So it's the Eden story, So what's going on with that? So that'll be something that you hear as he talks, as this is the Eden story, and he's going to break it down. And one of the things he's going to say is that there are scenes and themes and words that are going to be planted into these 4 chapters, that are going to grow and blossom and flower all through the Bible. Okay? And that's why it's so important to know this, because you get over to the New Testament, and where did that come from? Probably came from this story. Most everything in the Bible comes from this story. So that's one of the things he's going to say. He's going to use a real fancy word called chiasm. Just if you hear that, we've been talking about that a little bit, and it's a way that ancient people wrote, and he's going to explain it a little bit tonight, but think frames. That the biblical authors love to frame stories. They'll start something here, end it there, and in between they even do something, but you can know what the story's about if you'll read the first sentence and the last sentence. Okay? For example, in this story, the frame around this story is tilling the ground. It's at the beginning, In Genesis 2, verse 4, it says, when there was no one to till the ground. Okay? And that it ends with Adam being kicked out of the garden, tilling the ground. Okay? That's a frame around the story. That's a frame. But it's a very different tilling than God wanted it to be at the beginning of the story. Okay? And there's a reason why, because of all the things that happen. So just some things to listen for, and then we'll have just a few minutes afterwards to kind of talk about what we heard and those things. But yeah, let's play the video.
All right, let's move forward, shall we? From talking about the whole Bible to about 2 pages. I promised we're going to go as slow as we need to, relatively. Each scene here is planting a major seed that's going to blossom and flower throughout the rest of the biblical story. So it's worth taking our time in the Eden narrative. But we do want to talk about Cain and Abel and so on. So I'll help us move forward at the right speed. First, we're going to just make some big picture observations about what I'm just going to call the Eden narrative. It spans from Genesis 2, verse 4, on to the exile from Eden, which is at the end of chapter 23. So it's the Eden story, Genesis 2 and then Genesis 3. Here's something that's interesting. There's 2 scholars recently who, independently of each other, did a literary study of the Eden narrative, and they both came to similar conclusions, which is really remarkable in biblical studies. Because in the history of biblical interpretation, you look for patterns of agreement more than like total agreement, partial agreements. But this was interesting. They both, Jerome Walsh and David Dorsey, propose a reading in which the Eden narrative is broken up into 7 independent scenes. Now, I already am interested in that because that was an operative number in the design of Genesis 1, from the 7 days to the 7 words to all kinds of other things. And what they note is that it's what's called an inversion pattern, or sometimes called a chiasm, where the outer bits correspond meeting in at a center, and usually that center is some kind of pivot. So you go in, 1, 2, 3, 4, pivot, and then you almost are undoing or reversing the matching scenes and what follows. So let me just walk through this real quick. For me, this has been hugely illuminating. And again, this is my abstract chart. When you get into the actual text, it's repeated words, uniquely distributed, that are clues to this design structure. So we'll kind of point it out. But it begins with, we looked briefly, there's no plants and there's no humans to work the ground. So God makes a human, plants the garden, puts the human in the garden with trees. Hooray! Next scene. And the Lord saw that something was not good. Right? So we've resolved the first challenge. We've got a garden and humans. Hooray, first scene. Next scene. Something is not good. The human alone. So then this whole next scene is about going from one human to a family of humans, where the one becomes two to become one again. Close scene. Now we've got a family in the garden. Next scene. One of the beasts of the field has this 3-part conversation. Snake, woman responds, snake again. Then the conversation stops, and you get 2 verses, which are the middle verses of the whole narrative. And those 2 middle verses are themselves designed as a really intricate inversion, symmetry, where you have the tree, the woman sees the tree with her eyes, she takes and eat, the man takes and eat, their eyes are open, so they have to now do something with another tree. Do you see that? Come on. Yep. That's awesome. Yep. It's beautiful. The middle is itself a chiasm, and at the center of it is the taking and the eating, which is the pivotal act that reverses all the good things that just, you can just see it right there. So what happens is another long conversation, this time between God and the humans. So the snake and the human, now a conversation between God and the humans. What happens following this is the consequences. It's the poem in Genesis 3, the curse on the snake. And God does not curse the man or the woman, but he does inform them of the unfortunate consequences of their decision. And one of the key things of the consequences of their decision is that they're going to be at odds with each other now, which is the exact inversion of them, right? The one becomes 2 to become 1, and now here they are becoming 2 and driven apart for good. And then the narrative ends with the human being taken out of the garden. It began with him being created and put into the garden. Now he's put out of the garden to work the ground from which he was taken. That was the opening line. There was no human to work the ground. Now we've got a human to work the ground, but this was not how God, at least ideally, purposed for it to go. So there you go. The Eden narrative. I mean, you have to wonder, depending on your concept of how inspiration worked, was this like a dream, and then the author just woke up and it's like, I know, right? Or like, oh, here's how to do it, or here, you wonder these things, because this doesn't just happen unintentionally. Somebody prayerfully, under the guidance of the Spirit, designed the narrative this way. So let's study the narrative on the contours of this design, and certain things will stick out that maybe wouldn't stick out otherwise. So that's kind of the macro piece. Maybe just any observations, thoughts, or questions about this. We're actually going to observe these kinds of things on the macro level, on the smaller levels. Sometimes whole sections of a book work this way. This is like the bread and butter of the biblical authors, how they pattern things together. So, does that raise any thoughts, reflections for the moment before we dive in?
It's just interesting that in the middle of this chiastic structure, it's when the man and the woman actually act on their own.
Mm-hmm.
That's
interesting.
I was just looking at the layers above and below. They are created, they are spoken to. You know, there's that kind of thing, and then they act on their own, and then it turns back into they're spoken to again. There's consequences, etc. So it's kind of painful, actually, to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Thank you.
I actually do have one question. Thinking about the interplay between 3:16, where Eve is informed of the consequences for her actions, versus 2:24 through 25, where it seems like there's a narrator's interpolation. I understand like the literary structure, but maybe can you speak to the interplay between the intention for marriage, the commentary on it after the fall? It seems like maybe where the narrator says, "Oh, and by the way, this is why a man leaves his father and mother," versus like kind of where we're left at with the literary structure, with there's going to be tension.
Yes, you know, we will get there. I think that, yeah, that will best be, we're going to walk through each of these 7 scenes. And I think that the dynamic between the man and the woman is going to be most illuminated from within each individual scene. I think the thing to observe here is what God intended for one. Then, you're right, the pivot has both of them, each individually. Though they implicate each other, they're individually. This is the moment where the divide begins. What was meant to be one is divided right here at the literary center of it. And then it's all fallout from there. Yeah, so let's put a footnote on that, and we'll come back to it.
I wonder in 2:17 when God says, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat you shall surely die. What context they would have had, like in knowing whether to eat or not, because they wouldn't have known death. Or even like, would they even have a context of understanding like what the implications or consequences are? Yeah,
that's a wonderful question. Let's put a footnote in that. And when we get to, we're going to work our way slowly through each scene. And that will be the forefront question when we talk about the tree of knowing good and bad. Yep. Anything else about macro that's striking you?
Yeah, I mentioned that the center, and I think other places I've heard that in chiasms, often the thing in the middle is the point, the overall kind of central idea behind the larger structure. Do you think that's often the case for what you see, and is that the case here in terms of these themes of eating or kind of disobedience? Is that would you identify that as maybe the central point of what the narrative is trying to get at?
Yeah, I have a bit of a different take. I think what's at the center is at the center often because it's a pivot. Not necessarily the most important. Oftentimes, what this design structure does is it's allowing you to pair things, and in your mind to let now them illuminate each other. If you've ever read an introduction to biblical poetry, or just noticed that biblical poetry often works in these kind of patterns of repeated lines, short lines that kind of repeat what the first one said, but never identical, a little bit different. This is the same poetic communication strategy of repetition with variation. And so what your mind is meant to do is then now compare matching panels and then go for a walk and have a cup of tea. And think about the man and woman created to be one, but then sadly divided and against each other. And then that becomes a moment of meditation. So Yeah, that's kind of
Yeah. The middle is mostly the focus is on reversals and about how things change.
yeah.
and,
Sometimes
yeah.
if it's a chiasm,
Yeah.
sometimes the patterns will work different, and we'll see different ones. Sometimes it's what's called a forward symmetry,
Gotcha.
where it won't have a center. It'll just be a B, A, B, A, B. You know, they're poets.
Yeah.
They're authors. They work this form in a variety of ways, and we'll see it. That's right. Yep. Okay. So what we're going to do is turn our attention then to the first major block of the Eden narrative, which is about the creation of Eden and the creation of the human. And we're going to make it all of a half a verse in our first step. We're just going to take a glance at Genesis 2:4a. Is this nerdy or what? These are the generations of the skies and the land. So very clearly, this is some kind of heading, isn't it? If you, the biblical authors, ancient Hebrew manuscripts don't have punctuation, periods, and they don't. They do have, Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, have paragraphing where they'll indent, but they had a different way of doing it than how we conceive of it. So the biblical authors use things like this, where it's the narrator saying, hey, reader, like key intersection, here, taking a right. It's a moment where I'm speaking to you, the reader, to say, end of the previous scene, beginning of a new scene. And this word right here, generations, is going to appear 10 more times in the book of Genesis at hinge moments. So generations. Any other, I don't know, translations maybe you've come across? Actually, here, let me just, I'll...
The EIV is unfortunate in saying this is the account.
Yeah. Here, I'll put on the screen a comparison here of some different
The
translations.
NASB does that as well, too. Yeah, it's the account of the heavens and the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, so the new International Version has the account. ESV has generations, NASB account, NRSV generations. Let's get King James here. Yeah, generations. Okay, so this word generations, it's the Hebrew word toledot. And it comes from the root word yalad, which is to give birth. There are 9 more times this word will get used as kind of like structural headings, structural junctures in the book of Genesis. For a number of those, they're at the beginning of genealogies, which makes perfect sense since the word comes from to give birth. But there's a handful of times where it's used to introduce a new narrative scene, where it seems to be almost working in the abstract of what came out of, using the birth image almost metaphorically, what emerged out of the previous thing. So that's what I think the word generations, it generates. Kind of works as an English word. But just so you know, that's what's going on with the difference there. So this is the first time it occurs. We'll look at some of the others. But what this verse raises is a really interesting puzzle that different traditions answer in different ways. And the question is this: how does the narrative that follows, the creation of the human and the creation of the garden, how does it relate to the literary unit you just finished reading? Do you remember? Here, I'll turn back to my silly drawing here. Genesis 1 concluded with a very rosy, ideal portrait of the goal of this God's purpose. Humans, male and female, ruling together as partners, kings and queens of creation, over the creatures, managing God's world, his images. The 7th day, oh yes, you know, there's 6 days. In days 1 to 6, every day ends with the phrase, and there was evening and morning. The seventh day has no conclusion. It's as if it's meant to go on. Yeah? So it's as if Genesis 1 is giving us the ideal portrait. Which is why I think the gospel authors are constantly going to be using Eden, Genesis 1 imagery to describe Jesus, or why Paul will call Jesus the image of God, because it's like, finally, the ideal has come. So this is an interesting puzzle, how this portrait here in Genesis 1 relates to the narrative we're about to read. If you look at Genesis 2, verses 4 and 5, what you hear, after the heading, these are the generation of the skies and the land. In the day when Yahweh made the land and the skies, now no shrub of the field was yet in the land, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not yet sent rain upon the land, and there was no human to work the ground, but a stream would go up from the land, and it would water the whole face of the ground, and that was all set up. In other words, every one of those lines is a subordinate clause waiting for the arrival of the first action of the narrative. Do you see that? The first action of the narrative is actually verse 7. Yahweh forming a human out of the ground. So as we're looking at verse 5 saying no plants and no humans, has this ever, maybe it's occurred to you before, or maybe it's occurring to you in the moment, someone just say it out loud.
I thought that this was already taken care of and there was a man in the garden.
Yeah, that's right. Right? Yes. Not just a man, but a man and a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah? So what's the deal? So it's a natural question that arises from the text itself. We're not being skeptical. We're just making observations. Genesis 1 ended with man and woman as the image of God together. Now there's no human again. So what's happening? So this has puzzled readers for a long time. There's kind of three basic trajectories of how people have resolved this or thought about how they relate. My hunch is that there's an element of truth in all of them. And it's also just my temperament I'm a peacemaker on the whole. So I want to find what's good in everybody and every view and make the mega view that takes, but, right. So I'll quickly kind of walk this through. And this actually has really significant implications for how we understand the Eden narrative. So here's, incidentally, if you look at verse 4, it is itself another symmetry. And I'll just read it here. The first half of the verse, these are the generations of the skies and the land when they were created. Can I think of a narrative anywhere nearby about the creation of the heavens and the earth? Oh, do you see? That's a little, it's as if we're bundling Genesis 1 to 2, 3. We're just bundling it up now. The creation of the skies and the land. Genesis 2, verse 4b begins the narrative proper of the new unit. In the day when Yahweh Elohim made the land and the skies. So what's going to be at the forefront of the reader's attention in this narrative? The land. So the word order is shifted. It puts land first. And it begs the question of how the Eden narrative relates to the creation narrative. Okay. So it's as if even this little heading is aware that it's putting together two different takes on this. So here's a way to illustrate one view. This is a very prominent view. Essentially that the Eden narrative of chapter 2 is doing a double back in narrative time and replaying Genesis 6, but replaying day 6 of Genesis 1 but elaborating on it. So that's an interesting perspective. I do think there's an element of truth there. However, to simply say it's just a zooming in on day 6 doesn't quite work. And maybe before I go through my reasons, I'm curious, just as you think about it, can you think of challenges to this reading?
There's no plants, and there was already plants.
Okay.
As of day 3 or,
Okay.
or 3 or whenever the land came out. It was like right after that there was
That's
like
right.
plants.
That's
There was like trees and plants. And here I think it actually first thing it says that there's no plants, and then I think it goes right into Yahweh God forming the humans, which occurs before any animals or birds or fish or plants.
That's right. That's right. Totally. That's exactly right. So day 6 of Genesis is culminating this pattern of humans as the culmination. So yeah, everything's already there. Humans are the crown jewel, so to speak. Yeah, Genesis 2 has a totally different sequence. It's plants first, then humans, then animals, which is not like day 6 at all. If anything, it's day 3 and 6 in a blender. Yeah? Yeah. So, okay, so maybe you could say, maybe this is an early awareness of the literary design of Genesis 1. And so you can combine day 3 and 6 because they both have to do with the dry land, perhaps. It's hard to imagine that I'm to see all of Genesis 2 happening in one day, because there's there's the formation of the garden. There's enough time for a garden to sprout and then mature and then have fruit. Then for the human to get lonely. And then to get zoological and name a whole bunch of animals, and then to have some kind of long sleep. Are you with me? Yeah. So it's just kind of, maybe we're trying to make something fit here that's not quite supposed to fit that way. That's one piece. Another piece is this. That little phrase, the Toledot, as I said, it's the first of 10 times it's going to occur. 5 times in Genesis 1 through 11, 5 times in the stories from Abraham to Joseph. So that's interesting. Half of them in 1 to 11, the other half in 12 to 50 of Genesis. And what you'll notice is it occurs at key junctures of characters where there's a split in the line of the chosen and the non-chosen. So when you get a Toledot, you'll get, it's right near the split between Cain and Seth. And you'll get Cain's line, here, track with this. You'll get a story about Cain murdering his brother, and then the 7 generations that come from Cain. These are the Toledot of Adam and Seth. So we go back in narrative time, and then it's as if we kind of followed Cain off into history, double back, and then we follow the main character. And just repeat. Yeah. Just repeat this. Here are the sons of Noah, Ham and Japheth, and Shem. These are the Toledot of Shem. And then we go back, and it just happens through all of the generations and so on. So the purpose of these, from this point on, is to introduce a new juncture in the narrative where there's going to be a parting of ways. It doesn't seem to be that it's going way back or back in the narrative to elaborate something even more. It doesn't seem to have that function. Okay? So we're just making observations here. So that's view number 1. And in the notes, there's quotes and scholars who hold these views and so on. Feel free to nerd out to your heart's delight. Here's another view. That because of the way that Toledot generations notice works as this kind of transition moment, perhaps this is an invitation to see the Eden narrative happening in some way after Genesis 1. So if Genesis 1 is about the creation of a cosmic snow globe, where God's presence and the human realm are all wrapped together in a happy seventh-day rest that lasts forever. Then, at least that's Genesis 1. Then on this reading, Genesis 2 is giving us a zoomed-in focus on the creation of a central sacred space on the high ground, and of two representatives appointed who are called human and living one as royal priests in the sacred space, and they fail their role as royal priests. Are you with me? And that this would be happening at narrative time after the creation of a humanity as a whole. On this reading, this would be the first election narrative about the creation of a royal priesthood put into the sacred land to be the representative humans before God.
But then, would that also say that there were other humans created at the same time as Adam and Eve?
On this view, that is an implication,
Okay.
correct. Which does help explain where Cain met his wife.
Right.
And why the moment he's exiled from Eden, there's people who are going to kill me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go build a city.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So in other words,
Yeah.
once Cain is exiled from Eden, all of a sudden there's just people in the land. And that is an ancient puzzle that has caused readers to scratch their heads. So on this view, the forming of Adam and Eve is giving us something different than video camera footage of their material creation somehow. So I think there are challenges with this interpretation as well, however. And that's because in later iterations of the pattern, language from Genesis 1 and from Genesis 2 is going to be merged together as if it's talking about one thing. For example, Noah gets off the boat, and God repeats his words to the humans from Genesis 1. I'll show you. Genesis 9, verse 1. God says to Noah, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the land." But then he gives the animals as food, just as he gave the plants. So God says, hey, listen, you were all vegan in the garden. Nobody had to die. No creature had to die to feed another creature. Just eating the plants. Everybody's eating plants. Now what God knows about humans is that they're violent. And so if you're going to kill and eat the animals, let's at least regulate it. So let's go kosher with how we treat the animals, right? So that's all Genesis 1 portrait, isn't it? But then what he goes, the image of God gets repeated of Noah, and you're like, okay, Noah is a new Adam, a new Genesis 1. But then what he gets off the boat to go and do, as we saw with the garden and with the tent and the eating of the fruit of the vine, is all Eden stuff. It's as if Noah is both a Genesis 1 and 2 humanity in one. Mm-hmm. They're not separated into different, like here's the pre-Adam and Eve humans, and then here's Adam and Eve. And so what that, I think, shows is that within the pattern, the humanity of Genesis 1 is identical with the Adam and Eve in the garden of Genesis 2. Does that make any sense?
I have a question about it, though.
Yeah, please.
Is there a difference between what the authors are doing with Genesis 1 and 2, collapsing them, and what later authors will do with Israel and the Messiah, collapsing them as if they're the same person,
Correct.
or Jesus and the
Yes.
church?
Yes.
You know, like it seems like this is something that keeps on happening. Is there a difference?
That's a great question. In other words, when you meet a figure in Genesis 1, God creates Adam, human. And then what you learn about human is that one human actually consists of two. God created Adam, human, If I do the New American Standard, it's going to say man. And to me, the English word man means male, human. Yes? Anybody? I don't know. It's just a thing. It's how I grew up with English. So we're going to do something different. We're going to I'll give you a different version of, here we go. All right. This is Genesis 1, 26 through 28. And God said, let us make human in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule. Yes? And then all the list of animals. At the center of this is a little poem, a 3-line poem. And God created human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. That him there doesn't mean male human. It's a third person referring to the species human. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean God created man. It means he created human. Of what does that singular humanity consist? Male and female, he created them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the poetic lines are unfolding. God created human in the image. Look at that middle line. The middle line really just takes the words of the first line and changes the word order. So that now the third line, the image of God, is parallel to male and female. Does that make sense? And then he created him, he created them. So it's telling us that humanity is one and more than one simultaneously. When the many are one, you get the image of God. Yes? When the more than one are unified as one, they are the image of God. I think that's what this poem is trying to tell us. So what you get then in the next narrative is a dramatized narrative about the making of the one, how the one cannot fulfill this commission as only one. We need that one to become two, but then also to become one again, so that they can do the thing that God called them here to do. So there is, the Adam and Eve figures have a clear representative, or I'm going to start using the word archetypal, which we can define it, role in this narrative. And so on this view that the Eden narrative comes after, if they're presented as the representatives, priestly representatives of humanity, you can say about Adam and Eve what is true about all humanity. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that Adam and Eve necessarily are all humanity. Mm-hmm. So what's attractive about this view, and this is an old view, is that Genesis 1 is giving you like the global picture of the cosmic snow globe, where God and humans are at one. Genesis 2 then zooms in and is about the appointing, the creation of a chosen family to be representatives on behalf of all humanity. And that really fits with so much of what the rest of the Hebrew Bible is going to be about, isn't it? The selection of a few, or one, out of the many, but who represent the many and become God's vehicle to bring blessing to the many. That is, unless they're idiots and they bring curse on themselves and others instead. So this view actually has a lot going for it, I think. So I should say, I read as much as I could in preparation for this class on this set of issues, and the cement's still wet for me.
So what do y'all, first of all, questions, comments? I've got a couple things if we have time, but just to point out from all this, what I think he's trying to say to us about this. And then I want to finally ask our question. So what? For the Arlington Church as a missional church, so what? Is the final question. But any thoughts or anything you didn't understand or anything? Yeah.
And a different version, but I'm still confused on the views that he's.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to just state them real quick and see if that helps any. But basically what he said was chapter 1 and chapter 2 don't seem to fit. It seems to be two different stories in many ways. Okay? Obviously, it's a story about the same thing, but it's two different stories. Chapter 1 ends with day 7. God rested. Doesn't say there was evening and morning a seventh day. It doesn't say it was good. It just kind of ends. Okay? And he's kind of calling that, okay, let's say that's the ideal. This is what God had in mind, his vision. And that really tracks with the fact that when you go to the end of Revelation, the ideal seems to be back in so many different ways. You know, it was, God intended this. It didn't work out that way, but God's going to get it done, you know. But the beautiful thing about the Revelation 21 and 22 story is that embedded in that story, in God's ideal, is some of the things that humans did along the way. And they've been fixed, and they've been, you know, like cities. When you read Genesis 4 about the first city, it was just meant to keep people away and to protect me. That was not God's. He didn't want a world like that somebody needed to build a city to protect themselves and keep everybody away, you know. So chapter 1 is the ideal. Then we kind of start a new story. And it starts with the sentence, these are the generations of the, basically says heaven and the earth. Okay? And he spent some time talking about the fact that that sentence is throughout Genesis. These are the generations. These are the generations. By the way, I have a list of all the places if anybody would like a copy. I printed out a copy of these are the generations, all the times that it's said in Genesis, 10 times. So it starts with that. And then it goes into a confusing paragraph that doesn't seem to fit day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from chapter 1. You're like, what? You know? And so he's basically saying that, you know. And then in the midst of all that situation where hadn't been any rain and there was no plants yet and there were no, you know, he makes human, you know. And in chapter 1, everything seems to be set in place. It's just this perfect little world. And now it's time to put humans in there. You know, everything's ready. Everything's ready. We got everything ready. And in the second chapter story, it seemed there's no plant, there's no shrubs, there's no, it's not even being watered except by God. And God formed man. Adam is the Hebrew word for human. God formed human. So, the question that's the shape. So the question you're asking, a little confused about that. You have joined a long line of people over millennia confused by this. You know? And so he said there are kind of 3 different ways people have gone, you know, with it. Number 1, this is we're zooming in on day 6. That's what we're doing. The problem with that view is he mentioned there's no animals, there's no, you know, there's a big problem with that view. It doesn't appear at all that the purpose that they had in doing this, what we're assuming as people who are reading the Bible and saying the Bible is inspired, is we're assuming coming into this room tonight, even if we can't comprehend it yet, there was a reason for doing this. And it wasn't confusing when it was written. Okay? Maybe confusing to us on first glance. It may be confusing to us there. But it doesn't appear at all to be the first view that, well, let's just go back now and walk through day 6. Okay? Because if the Genesis writer would have just started the story by saying, and God formed man out of the dust of the earth, then yeah, that would be a great, but he puts this whole paragraph in there about there were no shrubs, there's no plants, there's no rain or anything like that. So that doesn't seem, so that's view number 1. View number 2 is that what's being described here now comes after. God is now resting on the earth. God's resting. Okay? It's day 7. And in Genesis, according to Genesis 1, it didn't really have an end. This is the way it's going to be. This is we're just going to continue. More, just assuming evening and morning and evening and morning and evening and morning, and God is resting and resting and resting and resting and resting, and Adam and Eve are tilling and making and being fruitful and multiplying, and and so at some point, sometimes your TV might say 6 months later, or 2 years later, that chapter 2 is, and 2 years later, the big problem with that view is he makes Adam and Eve. It doesn't just say, one day, while Adam and Eve were doing their thing and doing what they were doing, a snake appeared. It doesn't start with that. It's got that troubling thing with God formed Adam out of the dust of the earth, and God formed Eve out of the side of Adam, and it's got all that stuff. So that view doesn't, that it happened after. That we're reading 6 months down the line, or 2 years, or 20 years, or however long. Does that make sense? Am I doing okay so far? Making it clear? So view 1, we're just zooming in on day 6. View 2, a little time has passed. And now it's time for the next chapter in the story. They've been doing all their chapter 1 and every day, God's resting and all this stuff. View 3 is that Adam and Eve are presented as representatives out of humanity. It's not trying to say, let me tell you about the very first people that ever lived on the earth. But God created this world, and he appointed chosen people, chosen humanity. And so he talks about their origin, where they came from. They're human. They came from the dust just like everybody else did around. But Adam and Eve are being put forth whether or not, and you can kind of read it both ways in this view. Most people who have this view, by the way, I have this view, and I take a little bit from, I'm kind of like him, where I am right now with it. And that Adam and Eve are being presented just like Noah, just like Abraham, just like Moses, just like Jesus, as royal representatives of humanity. We are humanity, We represent humanity, And so it tells their origin story, in a sense. Their origin story, where did they come from? They came from the dust. So did all these other humans. And this helps explain when you turn over to chapter 4, Cain finds a wife. That's always been, where'd she come from? Cain's afraid of people killing him. Who? You're like the third person on the whole planet. Who's going to kill you? But all of a sudden, Cain's scared of all these people. And it's more telling it's telling a human origin story in the sense that humans were created by God, breathed into them, became the image of God, have the potential of the image of God in them, and were created by him. And they're represented by this couple, this family. To be in a sacred space, to be in a temple garden, and they were to do the things that humanity was supposed to do so that humanity could look and say, that's what we're supposed to be. Okay? And so they were held up. Now, in the ancient mind, by the way, that fits the ancient mind too. Because in the ancient mind, who were the sons of God that everybody was supposed to look up to? The kings. The kings were supposed to be that. And so there's royal language in here for Adam and Eve. They're made in our image. Let them rule. Let them, instead of just certain people lead, all humanity was supposed to lead, and all humanity. And so what we're reading here in view 3 is we're reading here the story of God setting sacred space, and God setting royal representatives to be representative of the whole human race, and to invite the whole human race there to that place, and to expand God's royal decrees to the rest of humanity. Does that help any? Okay, so it's not really, so view number 3 doesn't become, it's not after, it's not later on, after some time has passed. It's not just, hey, let's go backward in time and let's go to back to day 6. It's not going forward in time and saying 6 months later this happened. It's saying, let me tell you the story of what humanity is to be, and tell you the story of what humanity chose to be instead of what it was meant to be, because humanity had a choice put in front of them. Okay? Now, does that mean people immediately raise their hands? I can tell you when describing this in class. Are you telling me Adam and Eve didn't exist? No. They're representative. Did Abraham exist? Did Noah exist? Exactly. Yeah, it was much more comfortable. But they're doing something here. And he's raising a very important question for a church on mission. What's the relationship between these two things? And it has to do with last night's a perfect example. Let me use that example before we go. In this out here, you had, and it's hard to differentiate, because we have to be really careful about saying we're in, they're out. Please don't hear me saying that. But out here last night, you had some people who were attempting to be God's royal representative in sacred space. And you had all of humanity out here as well. Okay? And in the Genesis 1 and 2 story, I believe, all of humanity is supposed to be able to see what a beautiful garden sacred space is. Because God's royal representatives out of humanity have said, here's what it looks like. And watch what we're doing, and watch what we're saying, and watch how we're saying it. And then there's all of humanity out there. Okay? And then you've got the potential of God's royal representatives, Betty Smith and Sue Mink starting a fist fight. That would have been a terrible look in sacred space. Mark might have banished you all from sacred space and told you to go home or something like that, if I could retell the story, a little bit. Does that make sense? I mean, that's that view with a couple of things coming in. In a way, you can use the word zoom in. We're zooming in on a part of the story, and here's the ideal. But it's not just simply saying that a few days after God rested, then Adam and Eve, or let me go back and explain day 6. It's saying, let's kind of present a cosmic picture now of this human and God image thing. How did that all come about? How did that all, and then he talked in there about the image of God being, humanity is really two things. Okay? This is where we talk about the homosexual agenda and all those things, as if people are asking us and talking to us about it, of what is humanity. It's not, are you this, are you that, but what is humanity? What is humanity? And humanity is two parts, unified in one. And that's where the image of God is perfect, Is there very much of God's humanity and creation that is perfect and ordered like it should be? No. That's the second place we need to be coming from when it comes to that issue and that agenda, is that we don't have it perfectly ordered either. You know, we stand there like, well, we've got this perfectly right. You know, no. We're all kind of, in a sense, banished from Eden, in a sense, yeah. Wayne?
On that last part you was discussing,
Yeah.
I do see order in the way the earth was created, the way the sun was created, the way a day was created, time was created,
Yeah.
and those things remain good.
Yeah.
But what I see here is humanity in the creation. Didn't go exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. The real focus is on humanity. That's a great point. That humanity.
There's evidence of God's order,
Right.
and that's why it's being described to us.
Yeah.
And it will be a key point later as well as Paul starts talking,
Yeah.
reflecting back to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to figure out what is the good of humanity
Mhm.
and what's God intended for the good of humanity.
Yeah.
As far as Adam and Eve, as individual persons, they serve both.
Yeah.
They serve the human, the first human creation,
Exactly.
but they also serve the ideal of humanity as created in the image of God. So I see that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. This could be an origin story without being the first. I mean, in a sense. I mean, and it can be the first too.
There's no concrete evidence here. There's confusion,
Yeah.
and that's the problem.
Yeah.
And so people try to interpret it in concrete, but it's a little more abstract.
Yeah. Yeah. I think overall, we as God's people seeking to be His representatives in this world more and more and more need to, first of all, say, man, we just don't know everything, and that's okay. Okay? Secondly, and start from there instead of religion being the place that we know everything. And we can tell you this is exactly right and this is exactly wrong. We need to start from a different place. That's one of the things that this story is saying to us. You know, one of the most important things is that, man, as fellow humans, as fellow Adams, man, let's sit down and this is a puzzle, isn't it? Let's sit down and do it together. Let's talk about it together. You know, let's do it together and discover together and journey together. And you know, I one last thing, and I promise we'll go. I just need to tell you this because I spent some time this past week. I have puzzled over that long paragraph that he mentioned about there were no shrubs and there were no plants, and I've puzzled over that for a long time. You know, I long time ago got rid of the view that, well, this is talking about day 6, because whatever it means, it's not talking about day 6. It's, you know, because then people can go, see, the Bible's wrong, you know, and I've heard people do that. But I really tried to meditate over that this week and walking and praying and thinking. And one thought that came to me is that at the beginning of this narrative, God wants to say, do I have to have humanity for this to work? Because it just keeps saying, and there was no shrub, and there was no plant, there was no one to till the ground, yet God watered it, and yet water came up. It's, you know, it's as if there was no human, and so it all fell apart. What does it say? But God watered it, and God took care of it. And right at the beginning, the first thing he says about human is, you're not indispensable. I can do this. I can run this whole creation without you ever picking up a shovel and tilling the ground. I want to give you this as a gift. I want to lay this palette out here, and I want to put these 300 colors, and you color. And you discover and you create and you go. That makes more sense on that paragraph to me than anything I've ever come across. Is that God is saying, you know, I can do this, and yet God watered it and it was being taken care of, and yet God formed out of the dust of the ground a human and breathed into him the breath of life, breathed into them the breath of life. Yeah.
But to go along with what you're saying, I thought about it too, setback.
Yeah.
And one of the conclusions I came to is, you know, the order that God created.
Mm-hmm.
The taking care of the plants was essential because what he was going to create would rely on.
Yeah.
But what he was also going to create is something to glorify him, to give glory to him.
Yeah.
Like all the rest of creation already is.
Yeah.
He wants to top it off with his image.
Yeah.
And so when he talks about his image, that creation feeds it, feeds the image of him
Yeah.
that's supposed to glorify him.
Yeah.
Because think about it nutritionally. When you eat plants that grow in dirt. All right? And the dirt's got nutrition, nutrients, minerals. You consume those to live and to
Yeah.
create.
Yeah.
What happens later is he gives them permission to kill the animals. If you're going to kill things, that's regulated. I get that. Because what you're doing is robbing that part of creation of its nutrients.
Yeah.
You're not getting, well, maybe protein would be something you get from it that you would get readily from everything else. But you still get protein out of plants. If you do it right.
Yeah.
You see that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the animal becomes another way of feeding the image and
Yeah.
allowing it to thrive.
Yeah.
But it still has to pay off.
Yeah. And it seems to be an allowance. It seems I will allow, you know, from now on you'll do this. Yeah.
It's a way of dealing with the inadequacies of what he created,
Yeah.
but hoping he would choose to do.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. All right. I know it's past time. Betty, did that help at all?